What happens when the world's most important energy choke point slowly loses the power that made it one of the most strategic waterways on Earth? For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been viewed as the ultimate pressure point of the global oil market. Roughly 1/5 of internationally traded crude has traditionally passed through this narrow stretch of water, giving any disruption the potential to ripple across economies within hours. Governments planned around it. Energy traders feared it. Military strategists studied it. For years, Iran relied on the assumption that this geographic reality alone guaranteed it enormous strategic leverage. But in the spring of 2026, something began to change, not because the geography moved, but because the infrastructure around it did. The turning point did not begin with a military operation or an international treaty. It began with an unusually direct statement from you, as Energy Secretary Chris Wright. Speaking publicly in May 26, he argued that the Strait of Hormuz was becoming a card you can play once. It was a simple sentence, but behind it was a much larger strategic argument. His point was not that Hormuz had suddenly become unimportant. Rather, he suggested that every attempt to use the waterway as geopolitical leverage was accelerating efforts to reduce dependence on it altogether. Instead of forcing the world to permanently accept the risk, repeated disruptions were motivating governments to invest in alternatives that would gradually weaken the strait's strategic importance. To understand why that statement attracted so much attention, you have to look hundreds of kilometers away from the strait itself. Beneath the desert of the United Arab Emirates lies a pipeline that rarely made international headlines before this crisis. Running from the Habs-Han oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, it bypasses the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Unlike oil tankers that must navigate one of the world's busiest maritime corridors, oil moving through this pipeline reaches open water without ever entering the narrow passager, on as long viewed as its greatest strategic advantage. When the latest regional crisis intensified, that pipeline suddenly became one of the most valuable pieces of energy infrastructure in the world. The project itself was never intended as a response to a single conflict. Planning began nearly 2 decades earlier when Emirati officials concluded that relying exclusively on Hormuz created an unacceptable long-term vulnerability. Construction moved forward through the late 2010s, and by the early 2010s the pipeline was operational. At the time, many observers viewed it as an expensive insurance policy against a disruption that might never happen. Few imagined that years later it would become one of the primary export routes sustaining Gulf energy shipments during an extended period of regional instability. By 2026, however, that insurance policy had become indispensable. As concerns surrounding maritime security intensified, the Habs-Han Fujairah pipeline operated at increasingly high utilization, allowing substantial volumes of crude oil to continue reaching international markets, even while uncertainty surrounded shipping through Hormuz. Instead of relying entirely on tankers departing from ports inside the Persian Gulf, producers gained the ability to move significant quantities of oil directly to the Gulf of Oman, reducing both transit risk and political exposure. That success encouraged something even more ambitious. In May 2026, senior officials from the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company announced that construction of a second parallel pipeline had been significantly accelerated. The objective was straightforward: double export capacity through Fujairah and further reduce dependence on Hormuz. Rather than waiting years for normal infrastructure planning cycles, the project was elevated to strategic priority status, reflecting a broader reassessment of regional energy security. Executives described the decision in practical rather than political terms. Months of disruption had demonstrated how vulnerable concentrated export routes could become during periods of tension. Diversification, once viewed primarily as a commercial objective, had become a matter of national resilience. The timing was significant. Energy markets had already experienced repeated periods of volatility as uncertainty surrounding Gulf shipping routes affected prices and insurance costs. Every interruption reinforced a lesson that governments, producers, and importers were reaching simultaneously. Dependence on a single maritime choke point carried risks extending far beyond military strategy. It affected investment decisions, supply planning, transportation costs, and ultimately the stability of the global energy system. That realization extended well beyond the Gulf itself. Major Asian energy importers, including Japan, South Korea, India, and China, have long depended heavily on Gulf crude. For these economies, uninterrupted access to energy is not simply a commercial concern but a national strategic priority. Every additional export route reduces the possibility that a single disruption could affect millions of barrels of daily supply. As a result, infrastructure projects continued to attract growing international attention, not because they eliminated risk entirely, but because they distributed it across multiple routes instead of concentrating it in one. The UAE was not alone in drawing this conclusion. Saudi Arabia had already spent years expanding its own east-to-west pipeline network, allowing crude from its eastern oil fields to reach ports on the Red Sea without passing through Hormuz. Although these systems cannot replace every barrel that traditionally transits the strait, together they represent a gradual shift in the architecture of Gulf energy exports. Instead of relying on a single gateway, producers are steadily building a network of alternatives. This distinction matters. The Strait of Hormuz is not becoming irrelevant overnight. Large volumes of oil will continue to move through it for years to come, and several Gulf producers still lack significant bypass capacity. But strategic influence is rarely at all minus or minus nothing equation. Every additional barrel that can leave the region without entering Hormuz slightly reduces the leverage historically associated with controlling the waterway. That change is measured not in headlines, but in infrastructure. Steel pipelines stretching across the desert may appear less dramatic than naval deployments or missile launches, yet they often reshape geopolitics more permanently. Unlike military operations, which produce immediate results but temporary effects, infrastructure changes the way countries operate for decades. This is precisely why the current construction effort has attracted so much attention among energy analysts. Every kilometer of new pipeline represents more than engineering progress. It represents a long-term adjustment in how producers, consumers, and investors evaluate geopolitical risk. What began as contingency planning has evolved into a structural redesign of regional energy logistics. Viewed from this perspective, the question is no longer simply whether the Strait of Hormuz can be disrupted. The more important question is whether the world will continue allowing that disruption to determine the global energy system. That may ultimately become the defining strategic legacy of this crisis. Because while military planners focus on protecting shipping lanes and diplomats negotiate temporary periods of stability, construction crews continue laying pipe beneath the desert, creating infrastructure designed not for the next news cycle, but for the next generation of energy security. And that is where the story becomes far more interesting. The struggle over the Strait of Hormuz is no longer being fought only by warships on the water or aircraft in the sky. Increasingly, it is being fought by engineers, construction equipment, investment decisions, and the quiet expansion of export routes that gradually reduce the strategic value of the world's most famous energy choke point. The consequences of that transformation may outlast the current crisis by decades. Even if the second pipeline reaches full operation on schedule, however, it would be inaccurate to argue that Iran's leverage disappears overnight. The reality is more complicated, and understanding that complexity is exactly what separates long-term strategy from short-term headlines. Several Gulf producers, including Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, and Bahrain, still depend almost entirely on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. They have no large-scale bypass comparable to the UAE's Habs-Fujairah route or Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline. As long as those countries remain dependent on the narrow waterway, Hormuz continues to matter. What is changing is not whether the strait is value, but how much of the world's energy system is willing to let that value determine its future. Even the UAE itself is not completely independent. While crude oil can increasingly move through overland infrastructure, many refined petroleum products still rely on maritime export routes. Storage terminals, loading facilities, and port operations remain exposed to missile and drone attacks. The pipeline is protected underground, but the facilities where the oil eventually reaches tankers are fixed targets that cannot simply disappear beneath the desert. Iran understands this perfectly. That explains why recent attacks have focused less on trying to physically close Hormuz itself and more on striking the infrastructure surrounding the alternative routes. Fires at Fujairah, attacks against vessels operating near Emirati waters, and strikes aimed towards Saudi Arabia's Red Sea export facilities all reveal the same strategic calculation. If Tehran cannot stop the pipeline beneath the sand, it can still attempt to disrupt the ports that make the pipeline economically useful. Yet every month that passes makes that strategy more difficult. Ports can be repaired. Storage tanks can be rebuilt. Hermitas defense systems can be reinforced. Additional interceptors can be deployed. Underground pipelines, once completed, continue carrying oil regardless of what happens above the surface. That difference changes the balance between offense and defense in ways that favor the producer rather than the attacker. Seen from a broader perspective, the current conflict has accelerated a structural transformation that energy planners discussed for years but never treated as urgent. Before 2026, bypass routes were viewed as insurance policies valuable to have but expensive to build. After months of disruption, they have become national security projects. The UAE is no longer expanding export capacity simply to increase production. It is building strategic resilience. Saudi Arabia has reached the same conclusion. The United States has openly encouraged the shift. And major Asian importers, including Japan, South Korea, India, and China, have every incentive to support infrastructure that reduces dependence on a single maritime choke point. That may ultimately become the most significant consequence of the crisis. Throughout modern history, the Strait of Hormuz has derived its power not merely from geography, but from the absence of alternatives. Nearly every barrel exported from the Gulf had to pass through the same narrow corridor. That concentration gave any disruption global consequences. The moment credible alternatives begin handling a meaningful share of regional exports, the strategic equation starts changing. Not immediately, not completely, but permanently. Markets have already begun responding to that reality. The premium buyers are willing to pay for cargoes loaded from ports outside the strait reflects more than temporary wartime pricing. It represents the value assigned to logistical certainty. Every successful shipment through Fujairah reinforces confidence in alternative infrastructure. Every additional kilometer of pipeline reduces the economic leverage associated with Hormuz. Every investment decision made today reflects assumptions about the next 20 or 30 years, not merely the next news cycle. From Washington's perspective, this explains the remarkable simplicity of Energy Secretary Chris Wright's statement. His argument was not that the strait suddenly no longer matters. His point was that once countries experience the consequences of relying on a single vulnerable corridor, they rarely choose to remain dependent on it. Infrastructure changes behavior. Behavior changes strategy. Strategy eventually changes geopolitics. Iran therefore faces an increasingly difficult dilemma. The more aggressively it demonstrates its ability to threaten Hormuz, the stronger the incentive becomes for its neighbors and customers to eliminate that vulnerability altogether. Every successful disruption justifies another pipeline. Every spike in oil prices encourages another investment. Every insurance premium strengthens the economic case for bypass routes that previously seemed too expensive. In that sense, the very weapon designed to maximize Tehran's leverage may also be accelerating the long-term decline of that leverage. History offers many examples of strategic tools losing effectiveness after their first decisive use. Fortifications become obsolete after artillery evolves. Battleships lose dominance after aircraft carriers emerge. Economic sanctions lose influence once supply chains adapt. Maritime choke points are no different. They retain enormous value until the surrounding system evolves around them. That evolution is now visible across the Gulf. None of this means the current crisis is over. Shipping remains exposed. Energy markets remain sensitive. Military deployments throughout the region remain elevated. A single successful attack on a major tanker could still send prices sharply higher within hours. The risks are real, and no serious analyst would argue otherwise. But beneath those immediate dangers, another story is unfolding at a slower pace. Construction crews continue laying steel across the Emirati desert. Saudi Arabia continues expanding westbound export capacity. Importing nations continue investing in supply diversification. Financial markets continue pricing logistical resilience more highly than ever before. These developments receive far less attention than missile launches or diplomatic statements, yet they may shape the region far longer than either. The irony is difficult to ignore. Iran spent decades cultivating the ability to threaten the world's most important energy corridor. When it finally demonstrated that capability at full scale, the rest of the energy system responded not by accepting permanent vulnerability, but by accelerating the construction of alternatives. The immediate disruption was real. The long-term response may prove even more significant. If current projects continue as planned, the Gulf's largest producers will gradually gain the ability to export increasing volumes without relying exclusively on the strait. Hormuz will remain important, but it will no longer be irreplaceable. That distinction may define Middle Eastern energy politics for decades. The pipeline stretching beneath the desert is therefore more than an engineering project. It represents a strategic adaptation, not an answer to one conflict, but an answer to the possibility that similar conflicts will happen again. That is why Chris Wright described Hormuz as a card you can play once. Not because the geography has changed, not because Iran has lost the ability to threaten the waterway, but because every time that threat is used, the world becomes more determined to ensure it never carries the same weight again. The most important transformation taking place in the Gulf today is not happening above the water. It is happening beneath the sand, one welded section of pipeline at a time. When historians eventually look back on this period, they may conclude that the decisive moment was not the closure of the strait itself, but the decision by regional producers to build a future in which closing it would no longer determine the outcome. That future is still under construction, but every passing month brings it closer.